So in the last video, we looked at situation factors and how those apply to the idea of why we set up factories where we do, whether it's closer to the markets or whether it's closer to the inputs made for the products. So now we're going to look at situation factors, another important identifier for why we set up factories where we do. And this time it's going to be in relation to the cost of the actual site of the location of the factory, not accessibility or location across to the marketplace or to the inputs. So very different in the sense, but both of them are very important and help us understand why factories or businesses choose to put themselves where they do. So that's what we want to be understanding with this video. So as the definition was just kind of described, physical location of a place for site factors that include the unique factors of production inside of a place or factory. So that results in land, labor, and capital, which we will define here very shortly. So labor are those who work in the industry and are paying for those workers. So that's about 500 million people working worldwide in some sort of labor manufacturing. So that would include, about 1/14 of the world's population that works in the secondary type industry. Okay, and that's led predominantly nowadays by China and India, and then all the developed world combined for the largest groups. Okay, so one thing we got to understand is cost. All right, so when it comes to the actual cost and affordability, we're going to unfortunately see that it is a lot cheaper to have workers in, again, developing countries, think periphery and semi-periphery, than it does to have them here in the core countries. And that's going to be a very big determinant, as we will see, for why manufacturing and industry jobs have moved out of the developed world, which again, with both pros and cons, both for the environment, for workers, and sustainability, and we will again revisit that at a later time. So one thing we have to consider is what type of industry it is. Is it labor intensive, high wage intensive, or is it what we consider to be capital intensive? So the idea of labor intensive, because we're still here with the idea of labor, is an industry in which wages and other compensation that are paid to employees is a very high percentage of the expenses. So that means that they're spending a lot of money on employee salary, their health care, paid vacation. Those are all kind of included, retirement benefits. All of that kind of fits in with, a industry where we're paying a lot in terms of our workforce. Okay, now that's very different from what we consider to be a high wage industry. Those are not the same, okay, because a high wage industry is what's measured in money. Okay, so an example here for what we consider to be auto workers versus clothing workers. Okay, so auto workers are a high wage industry comparatively or relatively compared to clothing workers, okay, or textile workers, if you will, same idea, or same thing, just different words. So high wage for auto workers, but most of the expenses actually end up going towards the vehicle parts. So the stuff that is used for the making of the vehicle, think all the various parts that go into making a car, but then also the technology used to actually assemble it is a lot more expensive than the actual workers. All right, so the labor cost in terms of actually putting a car together, how much does it cost for all the workers, including their wages, benefits, salaries, is usually about 5%. 95% goes again to about the machinery, to the actual pieces used to make said car. Okay, that makes up a lot more of it. But, however, auto workers get paid higher than clothing workers. Okay. So in this case, auto workers are not labor intensive. It's capital intensive, but it's high wage. All right. So clothing workers are not paid as much, but the cost of putting the shirt together to make a shirt, okay, based on the materials and technology needed, is low. So you pay the worker more than what you do for the actual expenses. So in this case, clothing is a labor intensive industry because you pay a higher percentage for the workers than you do for the actual stuff to put the actual product together. All right, and so that's kind of the big difference. Even though clothing workers are paid less, okay, they are a labor intensive because it takes more. They use more workers and they pay more for the work than they actually do for the actual technology. All right. Another way to look at this is the sense that also clothing manufacturing, in terms of how to put clothing together, stitching, and all that, is typically not as intensive in terms of training. So thus you need lower skilled workers or people who it wouldn't take as long to train in on than you would for working on a car. So that'd be considered more high skilled or higher skilled type job for manufacturing. All right. So when we consider also the hourly wages for industrial workers here, We can kind of see again with our developed countries much, much higher. The book says somewhere between 30 to 40 in more developed countries, okay, and in many cases a lot less in developing countries, particularly India, China, Indonesia, average $2. So, and that also applies to a lot of other countries and not just them too. These are just kind of the bigger ones. And so that will again help to explain why a lot of factories are abroad, because it's not just, relation to the markets, but what does it actually cost to put it all together and then ship it out? And that should be telling you how expensive it actually is or how they can make their profits, because that'll help explain whether they care more about the situation factors or more about site factors. Okay, so another piece to look at here is capital, all right, and that is essentially the money that you need to establish a factory or expand on it. All right, so this is often done, borrowing from banks or individuals or the government, in terms of actually getting the funding to establish said factory. So a capital-intensive industry is similar to what we just talked about with auto industry, okay, where you spend a high percentage of expenses on producing the good or service with the technology and the parts, not the labor. So even though you pay your auto workers more than you pay your clothing workers, the technology needed to make the car part is way more expensive and way more intensive than it is for clothing. So even though auto workers are higher wages, they're more capital intensive than they are labor intensive. Because again, the labor used for cars is only about 5% of what you're actually, 5% of your cost. All right. So we also typically see this among clustering with agglomeration and growth poles of similar capital intensive industries such as car manufacturing, Silicon Valley, with all the tech companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, although I don't know if Microsoft is based in Silicon Valley, but Facebook, Google, Apple are. All right, so you're spending more on goods and service than you are on the labor. So there's kind of your example. And then land, obviously we need land to establish the factory. So where can you have the land? And the area used for factories is determined by the land availability, and also location to the market, location to access to your workers, and location to energy sources, and how they can handle all the inputs and shipments for the product. So typically, historically, these were found in major cities next to railroads, and the railroads would oftentimes become established alongside those locations kind of as a result. And nowadays you find them, more factories, especially again in the more developed parts of the world. Think, the United States, even here in Minnesota, when we see many of our factories are clustered in suburban areas, often found near major transportation areas. So think highways and waterways, because again, easier access to both the factory and to the market, and not just via the railroads. And that obviously depends on the type of industry that you do have. All right, so that's kind of what we have here, and this would be an image of like the industrial park in Plymouth near where I grew up, because again, it was right next to 494, 169, 94. Okay, all kind of tied together. So very easy to transport those goods, not that far away from the airport, and you see a lot of those again in other parts of the Twin Cities metro and beyond too. So that covers up our talk on site factors. Again, the other half of where we determined to put factories based on, again, in this case, land, labor, capital, while situations, just to review real quick, is about transportation costs of goods either to the factory from the inputs or from the factory to the marketplace. So we put those together. That's where companies decide what are the best options and make it in order for us to make the most money. So then in the next video, we'll start talking about outsourcing, new division of labor, globalization, and why we see many of the factory and industry jobs moving outside of the developed world to the developing or semi-periphery and peripheral countries.